LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains references to suicide and graphic references to motor vehicle fatalities. If this content affects you, the number for Lifeline is 13 11 14. In 1980, three friends were travelling on the southwestern highway from Perth to Harvey. They encountered a slight bend and crashed into a tree. One of the friends, Terry, died at the scene. The two others escaped with minor injuries. Investigations began to find who was responsible, but both friends denied being the driver. The case was strange, and investigator Hadyn Green was unable to make an arrest until the appearance of a surprise piece of evidence. I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives.
I got to the crash scene just after 7, I think it was, in the morning from memory, and the car's still there. And what had happened was, on impact, the Commodore slammed headfirst into a rather large tree that was off to the right-hand side, driver's side of the road. As was usual, I was involved in the investigation of fatal and serious traffic accidents, which means that our squad, the Major Crash Investigation Unit, got called in when it looked like there was a possibility of a charge, a grievous bodily harm charge, something to do with the death of a person, perhaps dangerous driving, causing death, manslaughter, or even murder. So I was the bunny for the day, I suppose, and got the phone call quite early in the morning to say that this crash had occurred from my boss, old Merv Warner, who said, off you go down to Harvey. What had happened was, after the impact, there was a dead person found. The police were called by a passing motorist, and there was a young man laying on the dirt on the passenger side of the car. We'll call him Terry. Now, obviously, Terry couldn't tell us very much, but like with a lot of these things, you can gain a lot of information from the person, from their injuries, from their clothing, that type of thing. But obviously, Terry had been taken away to the hospital by the time that I got there. So all I had was this Commodore that had buried itself into a tree. There had been a young lady, we'll call her Becky, that was in the rear of the vehicle, and obviously she wasn't there either. Now, from what I was told, the owner of the car, young guy, we'll call him Martin, said that he couldn't remember the crash, couldn't remember driving home, couldn't remember leaving the nightclubs, couldn't remember anything until after the crash had occurred. That then left us in the position, because the young girl Becky had said that she was definitely not driving. She was asleep on the back seat of the car with her seatbelt on, and she had no idea who was driving, because she did recall that at one time when they're driving along they stopped, and she said it's quite possible Martin was originally driving. It's quite possible that the drivers were swapped. So, believing her story, the main thing I was faced with, obviously, was what caused this crash, and just as importantly, who was driving. Back then, we didn't have things like DNA and this sort of thing. This is pre-1985. we didn't have that stuff, so we had to rely on some of the older sciences. And if you think about it anyway, DNA probably wasn't really going to help us very much. These people were friends. They would have been in and out of this car. You could expect Terry's DNA to be almost anywhere, except what we would have looked for today would have been, was his DNA found on the steering wheel? Because obviously if it transpired that he'd never driven the car, then you wouldn't expect his DNA to be on the steering wheel. We'd look for things, and we did in this case, look for things like his fingerprints on the steering wheel, but there was nothing there, because the approach I always took was, whatever your hypothesis is in relation to something, try and disprove it. My hypothesis in relation to this was that Martin was the driver. It was his car. He'd driven to Perth. We know that he was driving when they left Perth. But the thing is, I had to put him in the driver's seat at the time of the crash. So that was my hypothesis, and I think that the correct approach is to try and disprove your hypothesis, not just look at things that are going to support your view of the world. So I was left now in the position where I couldn't prove who was the driver. So now let's look at the crash itself. There were no skid marks running off the road that would indicate that the vehicle had braked heavily before hitting the tree. There was a nice couple of lines from the wheels of the car, which followed each other very nicely, so the car wasn't slewing, it wasn't sliding or anything like that. It just simply carried on through this bend and front end on into this tree. The damage to the vehicle was quite extensive. The engine block had been pushed backwards and slightly to the passenger side, and I thought, how am I going to try and prove the speed at which the impact occurred? And there was a guy that I knew, a physicist by the name of Boden Generowitz. And so I gave Boden a shout and said, look, is there anything that we can do? I know that people have tried this in the past. And he said to me, he said, it's funny that you asked me, he said, because I've just been working on that exact thing of trying to estimate from the damage caused to a vehicle what speed it was travelling at. So I said, well, fantastic. I said, what do we need to do? And he said, well, I'll come down to Harvey and we'll have a look at this car. He said, if we can get the local fire brigade down there, the volunteers, he said, and put you up in a cherry picker and take a photograph looking directly down onto this vehicle. He said, because I've got something, and it was like a massively oversized tape measure, if you like, this massive piece of plastic with markings and all sorts of things on it. He came back with the speed, and I'm trying to remember exactly. I know it was about 130 kilometres an hour. That's on impact. So whether the car had slowed or accelerated before the crash, probably not. I tend to think that it just went straight in. Now that was in a 70 kilometre an hour zone. So there I am now, left with enough evidence to charge somebody, if it wasn't Terry that was driving, to charge somebody, and here we're looking at Martin, with enough to charge him at least with dangerous driving causing death, if not manslaughter. Probably not manslaughter, because you need that little bit extra if there was evidence of alcohol, because unfortunately the attending police hadn't put him on the breathalyzer or taken a blood sample or anything, because at that time you had to have a good idea who was the driver or know who was the driver.
That's going to sound strange, isn't it, Hadyn, to some of the listeners, that even a minor accident, nose to tail, in town, no physical injuries, nothing, police attend, first thing, everyone's breathalyzed. Back in the day, back in the 80s, I was in the police 85 through their general duties cars. They had them. They had breathalyzer units, but they certainly weren't used as a mandatory function in something such as this. This car's hit a tree at 130 kilometres an hour in a 70k zone, no skid marks, no nothing. I'm just interested too, in your experience, major crash investigation, What's going through your mind when are you thinking someone's fallen asleep at the wheel or something that's happened? Because it would be natural, wouldn't it, if the car has gone out of control or something such as that, that it would be an attempt to stop the car or divert the course of the car away from an upcoming tree or something. So what was going through your mind with regards to the cause and effect of that?
Well, there were two major possibilities in mind. One was that, as you said, someone's fallen asleep and the car's just kept going like a train on its tracks, and then there's this almighty slam. The other possibility is of mechanical failure. So obviously we got our vehicle examiners. We had a specialised unit of police officers that looked at major crashes and that type of thing to try and exclude any mechanical failure that might account for it, a steering failure or something like that. None of that was evident, I should say. My experience told me someone's fallen asleep. It's as simple as that, and we often hear this from our road safety people nowadays, tiredness kills, and it certainly does. And it killed young Terry, took his life, and who knows what he'd be doing nowadays. But that line of that family is gone forever.
Just on that too, you would be aware more than most that in a right-hand drive vehicle, the driver sitting on the right-hand side of the car, coming towards something like a tree or something such as that, there's always going to be that overriding instinct of self-protection where they tend to turn to the right. Yeah, they swerve to the right in that attempt to protect themselves from impact, which is why we see in fatal car accidents one of the most likely seats to sit in a car, which can lead to a fatal, of course, is the front passenger seat because of that very swerving away. And also, just again, without trying to get sort of too gory on this, but for the benefit of the listeners, you mentioned earlier that the deceased, who we're calling Terry in this stage, was actually seen outside of the car alongside the vehicle. And this is perhaps an indication to those listening of the incredible impact that occurs when something travelling at 130 kilometres an hour hits an immovable force, literally sending this individual through the windscreen, I would imagine, either from the back seat or from the front seat. It's quite incredible, isn't it, to see and to sometimes see how far an occupant of a vehicle can be projected through a window, through a windscreen at the scene of a crime like this.
Yeah, I've seen people propelled out of vehicles for, I think the longest would be about 40 metres, which, people think, 40 metres isn't far. But, I'd say to the listeners, put something on the ground and take 40 good strides and look back and see how far it is, and then think about what does it take to throw someone that sort of distance. Those impact forces are enormous. The deceleration is enormous. You just keep going forwards.
And you're talking, the physics of all of that, like you say, Hadyn, is the individual that goes through a windscreen or through the windscreen like this is travelling at 130 kilometres an hour. That's the speed at which they go through that windscreen.
They slow down as their legs hit the dashboard. The upper part of the whole of your body will be going forwards, and then your waist around that sort of area gets stopped by the dashboard, but the top keeps going and virtually drags you along. And that's one of the things that we used to look for was, where are the injuries on this individual? Because the injuries on a passenger that gets thrown from a vehicle at that sort of speed, and I'm talking here not where there's a rollover type injury, because that's very different, but the injuries to a person that a person will suffer from that deacceleration and being thrown out of the vehicle are very different to that of the driver. The driver has to get past the steering wheel first. So there's massive chest injuries. In a passenger, those injuries, you'll have massive chest injuries, massive head injuries in the majority of cases. But a lot of the injuries are going to be around the hip area and the legs area with grazing found on the limbs, the lower limbs. Those were present with Terry, but that wasn't enough to put Martin in the driver's seat. You know, we talk about circumstantial evidence, so that's evidence from which a jury, let's say, can infer. That wasn't strong enough in this case.
So following an investigation like this, you've put all these pieces of the puzzle together. You know, you've done all the mathematics, you've done all the physics, you've done everything else, but you are still, you may in your mind have an idea of what you believed happened, but as you rightly say, there's a difference between that and being able to prove that beyond reasonable doubt. So would it be fair to say that the case, it progressed to a point where it sort of couldn't progress any further, and you're left thinking, well, we don't have enough here to turn the key on anyone. We don't have enough to present a case in court. What happened after that?
We switched from being a police officer looking for the commission of a crime to being a coroner's investigator. So, and the coroner's interested in who is the deceased, how did they die, and what killed them. So I decided, all right, we'll send this off to the coroner and see if we can get anything. Now, Christmas was approaching, and as usual, because you build up quite a rapport with the families and loved ones of the people that you deal with and the people that are going to, I don't know which is worse, to sit in a wheelchair for the rest of your life and not be able to move or to be killed. I'm not sure. For me, I know what I would prefer, but you build up quite something of a rapport, and it was you tended to have these longer term relationships with people. So come Christmas time, it wasn't unusual for us as a squad to receive tens and tens and tens of Christmas cards, and they'd get dumped on your desk sort of thing, and when you came into work next day, there'd be this pile of cards and sort of looking through, and you open these things. And I remember I was going through the pile on my desk, and there was one, and I opened it, and it said, Mr. Green, I just want to say thanks for the way that you handled the crash. My name is Martin, shall we say, the driver of the car that crashed into the tree in Harvey. And it was, I got to say, I was a bit stunned for a moment, and I said to a guy that I worked with, Johnny Crawford, who was my offsider for this job, and I said, John, come and have a read of this. Am I reading this thing right? And his nickname was the Racing Woodbine because he always had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and he was about as skinny as a cigarette. And in his very English voice, he said, "You've got him, haven't you?" So yeah, the next thing, of course, we send that off for fingerprinting, and there's Martin's fingerprints all over the card and on the envelope. Today you'd do a DNA on the stamp, or if he's licked the seal or whatever else. Crofts and I decided that we were going to drive down to Harvey and talk to young Martin, and I remember when we knocked on his door and said, "We need to speak to you," and he had this look on his face, and he said, "Oh, I didn't know that I'd see you again." And I said, "Well, no, you sent me a Christmas card." And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "In the Christmas card, you said you were the driver." And he just stopped and just looked at us. "Did I?" And I said, "Yeah, I think that we really need to talk here." Yeah, long story there, I suppose. Cut short, he was charged with dangerous driving causing death and convicted and dealt with appropriately by the courts.
And he would have received a custodial sentence, I'd imagine, for that.
I mean, if he'd been convicted of manslaughter, yes, no doubt would have gone to prison. But the penalty back then was for dangerous driving causing death was a fine of $5,000 or 5 years imprisonment, or both. The penalty was so low in my mind for the taking of a human life as to almost be laughable. It just, yeah. And he got, from memory, he got a fairly substantial fine and obviously a licence disqualification, but no, never went to prison.
We know, Hadyn, that Australia, as a society, we have a disproportionately high level, quite confronting level of suicides amongst young adolescent sort of males. It's up there as one of the highest in the Western world, and we know that there are many examples of young men, country roads and otherwise, solo occupants of a vehicle. We know also, tragically, that there are a percentage of those cases which are in fact suicides. I'm interested in your take on that, and it's probably not a question you can succinctly answer, but attending jobs, single occupant, possibly a young man, oftentimes fatal. Thoughts on that?
You've reconjured in my mind what has always been a, how can I put this, a recurring nightmare for me. And please don't, I'm not asking you to feel bad about this. Most police carry around all sorts of baggage from the things that they see. I recall that, this was near Katanning, I think it was. Katanning or Narrogin, which again is in the south of Western Australia. A car had left the road and, again, slammed into a tree. And in this particular case, a young female passenger, the girlfriend of the driver, had been killed. So I investigated this one and decided that there was enough evidence to charge the driver, and he had a local solicitor. And a lot of the time, because we were just dealing mostly with ordinary people, and so often young people. So anyway, I rang this guy's lawyer and said, look, Bill, I've got enough evidence. Can you talk to your client? We'll come down. We'll do what we used to call, and I suppose it still happens today, an arrest by appointment, where you'd meet them at the police station, arrest them, charge them, put them through the book, put them out to bail, and they'd go home. They'd be on their way home, within an hour. Day or so later, get a phone call from Bill, and he said, look, I've spoken to my client who says if you charge him with killing his girlfriend, he will kill himself. Now, that, as an investigator, that's a horrible position to be put into, because on the one hand, you don't know if it's an empty threat. People say all sorts of things. On the other hand, it might not be not a threat. It might be a factual statement that this person is making. It could be that they're trying to duck getting charged, but your job as a pretty well an ordinary human being is to enforce the law. So subsequently, we did go down, charge this young chap, put him through them, did what I've already described. 3 days later, I get a phone call from the police station down there to say that this young bloke had got himself out to where this crash had occurred and had hung himself in the very same tree. Now, that equally could have been running another car into that tree or whatever else. So it happens, and I've had it where the lighthouse on the South Mole of Fremantle Harbour, there's a massive lighthouse at the end of it. They've now put a crash barrier in because it was fairly common for people to go racing along the South Mole and slam straight into this lighthouse. And predominantly they were young men. People do commit suicide, and you look at that And you look at what has happened before, there again, like the crash in Harvey, no tyre marks, no slew marks, you're looking at excessive speed. But never thought that the one in Harvey was that. That was always, in my mind, just someone that's run off the road and slammed into this enormous tree. And it's still there. I actually went for a drive up there a couple of weeks ago because I thought, I wonder if that tree is still there. And it's still there, and it's grown quite a bit since those days, but it's still there. Suicide on the road is, people commit suicide all the time on the roads, and that's immensely sad.
Hadyn, major crash investigation work. It's a grisly old side of policing. There are no two ways about it. Interestingly, I've spoken to police who have worked homicide, they've worked child exploitation, they've worked sex crimes. Some of them have been in the job 20, 30, some of them 40 years. When you chat to them about some of the most impactful jobs they've attended, some of the jobs that have stayed with them for the longest, I would say 9 times out of 10, these police will speak about issuing death notices as being the toughest job that they do. Major crime investigation, part of your work would have been not only attending these fatals, but issuing death notices for families, husbands, wives, mothers, fathers. Can you just walk us through that, Hadyn? Because I'm sure you would agree with that experience, that is some of the toughest work you'll ever do in the job.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know of any police officer that I've ever worked with that could say that, well, certainly not that they could enjoy something like that, but not that they ever got used to doing something like that. You imagine you don't know this family, you're about to go unannounced, knock on their door and tell them that dad's not coming home, or their son or their daughter or whatever is not coming home. You know that you are absolutely going to destroy those people with that news. But you also know that you have to do it. It's tough. It's tough. And it tears police to pieces. It does. And as much, I think, as well as it tears families to pieces. How many different ways have I seen people react to that news? There's no normal, if you want, reaction to that. I've seen people that have just quietly closed the front door on you as if you'd just given them their newspaper that had been laying out in the lawn or something. I've had people slam the front door. You've had people punch you in the face. You've had people that have said, oh, come inside and have a cup of tea and we'll talk about it. And you've had, obviously, those people that just simply disintegrate in front of you or won't believe what they're being told. But the worst one that I remember was a chap that was killed on Plain Street in East Perth. And we spoke to the driver and he told us the name of the passenger. We had nothing. And this guy, the dead person, had been a passenger in the car. He had nothing to identify him on him, no wallet, no driver's license, no anything. So we had to take this guy's word for it and went around and knocked on this door, and I can still see the door today, and I'm talking now perhaps 35, 40 years ago. Knock on the door, and this lady comes to the door, and I said, can we come inside because we've got some bad news for you. I knew that she knew instantly, but maybe I was reading that because when we came inside and we said, we believe that your son has been killed in a traffic crash, and she disintegrated, but the husband, of course, was in the room by this stage, hadn't seen us turn up, and he said, no, that's impossible. He said, he's asleep upstairs. And we said, well, this is the information we've been given. And he called out, and the young guy came downstairs. Deliberately, this guy, he had deliberately given us the wrong name because he hated police.
Hadyn, oftentimes, not always. I mean, when you're in the major crash investigation unit, you've got a few years under your belt in that environment. But you and I know also that there are plenty of times where it's the young coppers in the general duties cars who attend these jobs first. They're first on scene, and sergeant arrives. There could be one, could be two, could be multiple fatalities. And it's the young coppers, 19, 20 years of age, have to go back to the station, clean up, put a fresh uniform on, and go and knock on that door. You and I, similar vintage, back in our day, no training, no nothing. You learnt on the job. You walked up that driveway, rehearsing in your head what you were going to say to these parents, what you're going to say to this person. And as you said earlier, you can't predict the reaction, and different reaction every time. Also, even with all the training in the world, I guess you could argue, at the end of the day, what you say, it doesn't change anything. But you would have been there. You'd have sat in that car with that lump in your throat the size of a cricket ball, and you walk up that driveway for, say, a porch light that's on for a young kid that's never coming home, and you're bringing a dark cloud to that family that just never it destroys families. It can tear families apart. And it's often the most junior police that are tasked with those death notices.
Every time I heard one go out across the radio system, job would get dispatched. Sierra whatever sort of thing got a notification for you. And every time I heard that, my heart would go out to the young coppers. My thoughts are, I think I'm doing pretty good for all the things that I've seen, but I think about my colleagues that are not doing good at all. I've got a mate who's every night has nightmares of the things that he's seen and done. I'm lucky. I get flashbacks every now and then. I'll drive past somewhere and think, oh, I remember, armed robbery took place here, or someone was stabbed to death here, or shot here, or whatever else. But those young coppers are going to carry that around for the rest of their lives. It changes people. I've often had this saying, if you're going to partner up with a copper, do it while they are a copper. Don't do it before. Don't partner up with someone who then becomes a police officer, because they're going to change. They will change.
There's a story that always comes to my mind. You relate to this. I remember my young bloke, he's in his 20s now, Hadyn, but he was at school, high school, playing footy in year 10, I think, something like that. And it was sort of that, he went to a boys' school, so the boys, a few of them were going out that night, Saturday night, to a party. There's going to be girls there and things. And all the dads that were on the sideline were chatting about it. And I remember one of the dads said something like, goodness me, the young boys are starting to go out and about, starting to go to parties. And he said, goodness, imagine if you've got to knock on the door at bloody midnight tonight and your young bloke's standing there with a copper next to him because he's got in trouble or something like that. And the first thing that came to my mind, as I'm sure it would to yours, is I thought, try getting a knock at the door at midnight and you open the door and the coppers are there without your son.
I cannot imagine anything worse than losing one of my children. I don't know how I would survive that. I don't think I would survive that.
Hadyn, I just want to thank you so very much for joining us. You've joined us from across there in the studio in Bunbury, Western Australia. Yours has been such a wonderful insight. I want to thank you for being so open and so honest and sharing with us all those experiences. Thank you for your service to the good people of Western Australia and for taking the time to come in and have a chat to us. It's been great meeting you. I really enjoyed having a yarn to you.
Thank you.
Crime Insiders Detectives is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Brent Sanders, produced by Ed Gooden, and sound designed and imaged by Link Kelly.